I'd like to welcome you to the 7th Verizon Visiting Professorship in Business Ethics and Information Technology. My name is Mike Hoffman. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Business Ethics at Bentley College. And before I forget it, I want to remind you that there is a reception following the talk where there's free food and drinks. It's right outside in the forum, and it will be set up for you when the talk is completed. So please come and join us and meet Mr. Kidder at that time, and I think you'll have a good time talking about some of the ideas that were discussed in the lecture. I want to welcome also our guests. We have a number of guests here. Business and business ethics leaders from the Boston community, the surrounding area, from a variety of companies and organizations such as Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and Harvard University, PricewaterhouseCoopers, the MBTA, the Ethical Leadership Group. At least I think Carrie is coming. I haven't seen her yet, but she'll probably be here. Staples, and others. We also have some guests from the Institute for Global Ethics, from which Mr. Kidder comes from and is the president of, but I'll get to that momentarily. It's now my pleasure to introduce Ann Carroll. Ann is the Director of Ethics and Business Conduct at Verizon, and she has done us the honor of flying all the way up from New York, where she works and where she lives, New York City, to talk for just a few minutes about the Bentley Center for Business Ethics Verizon partnership, which, as I mentioned earlier, is now in its 7th year. Ann has worked for 25 years at Verizon. She seems too young for that as I look at her, but 25 years, and in a variety of different areas, including human resources and other function areas, but is now the head of their Ethics and Business Conduct Office and is in charge, therefore, of all of Verizon's efforts to maintain an ethical culture at the organization and to develop strategies for promoting that and for constantly strengthening that. And so it's a pleasure to have Ann with us to say a few words about the partnership. Ann?
Good afternoon, and thank you. As Mike said, we have a long-standing, Verizon and the Center for Business Ethics has a long-standing association, and we're very proud of that. And also, as Mike said, this is our 7th visiting professorship series. So we're very happy to participate with you in the dialogue around ethics in the business environment. Verizon's core values of integrity and respect are a fundamental part of our culture in how we interact not only with one another, but also with customers, investors, and the public at large. Our goal is to operate our business with the highest level of integrity and accountability, and we hold all of our employees to certain standards. Our goal is also to continue to build on the trust we have earned over the years. For those of you who are somewhat familiar, Verizon is an outgrowth of a number of different legacy companies, including New England Telephone, Bell Atlantic, and now Verizon. I've actually worked, in my 25 years, I've actually worked for 5 different companies, and yet never really left the company, if that makes any sense. Our ethics and compliance program includes a comprehensive code of conduct. You've all seen that as you've come into the auditorium. We've left some copies out there if you wanted to take a look at that. We also have extensive employee education and training programs and a confidential reporting system that's available to employees 24/7. And people can use this line to with inquiries regarding ethical decision-making, as well as to register allegations regarding unethical conduct. And it's a safe place for people to go. That's very important in this very highly competitive, performance-oriented organization as we are. Even with these systems in place, however, we cannot stand pat. We must continue to learn and keep pace with innovation and technology, ensuring that we maintain sound, ethical decision-making policies and practices. To that end, I am happy to be here today to participate in the learning and to continue the dialogue as to how to apply sound ethical practices in an ever-changing society. So thank you for coming today, and thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to participate with you later on today. Thanks.
Thanks, Ann. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kidder. First, I'd like to make sure you know that Dr. Kidder will be on campus all week, as our Verizon visiting professor always is. And he will be giving a number of talks, including a faculty workshop, which I think is on Thursday morning. And he will be giving a talk to the freshmen, a large freshman group of students, I think about 800 or 900 students, on their book that they've been reading called, I think it's called Fast Food Nation or something of that sort. And that ought to be interesting, and I'm sure any of you would be welcome to go to that. He's also giving a large lecture to a large number of students in the CIS program within the next day or two. So he'll be touching probably a couple of thousand of us here at the college, and this is his opening public lecture to sort of set the stage for those further conversations. I've known Rush for at least 10 or 15 years, and we have seen each other in passing, more or less, at various conferences and meetings in the whole business ethics movement, whether it's the Ethics Officer Association or other meetings that we've come in contact. And I've heard him lecture on a couple of different occasions, and I always said to myself, if we could get Dr. Kidder to come and talk to us, I think it would be really a great honor, and it would be something we would remember. So I was lucky enough to catch him at a time when he had a week, because normally he's lecturing all around the world, certainly all around the United States. He has a very busy travel schedule, and he's constantly in demand on his lecture schedule. Dr. Kidder founded the Institute for Global Ethics, IGE, in 1990, going on 15 years now. And the Center for Business Ethics is still ahead of him. We're going into our 29th year. But the amount of work that the Global Institute has done is just amazing. It has really been a terrific value-added institute in the whole business ethics movement. And Rush is the founder and president. Rush has published and lectured, as I said, extensively. His newest book is coming out this month. In fact, it's already published, and I think it's out on our table if you'd like to take a closer look at it, called Moral Courage. And I think a lot of the ideas that Rush is going to be talking about with us at the college this week stems out of the ideas that have gone into that thinking about moral courage. He His previous book on how good people make tough choices, resolving the dilemmas of ethical living, was referred to by former President Jimmy Carter as a thought-provoking guide to enlightened and progressive personal behavior. The book that he wrote before that, called Shared Values for a Troubled World, Conversations with Men and Women of Conscience, took him, I think, to 16 different countries where he interviewed eminent leaders and about the whole idea of ethics, and then put those interviews and ideas into that book. Bill Moyers noted that only Rush Kidder would have made this odyssey throughout the world to have gathered these ideas on ethics and whether they could be put together into some kind of universal code of ethics. And only Rush Kidder, says Bill Moyers, could have returned with such a valuable cargo of insights. Before founding IGE, Dr. Kidder was a senior columnist for the Christian Science Monitor, so a lot of his thinking about ethics started there and has continued over into his institute and really has poured out to the entire business ethics movement, and we have been all the beneficiaries of that. So we now, at this college, at Bentley, are going to be the beneficiaries of Dr. Kidder's ideas and insights and conversations over the next several days. With that, Rush, let me introduce you to our students.
Thank you, Mike, very much. Am I being heard? Yeah, good. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. I normally wear a bow tie, but the TV people said, no, do a long tie. And therefore, you and I have that in common with, as far as I can tell, pediatricians and lathe operators. Think about that. Think about why, anyway. But, and thank you, Ann, very much. Thanks for making this all possible. Great. Well, as I say, my real question is why are you here today? And let me give you a couple of answers. I think you're here in part because Martha Stewart is in Camp Cupcake. And I think you're here because Bernie Ebbers and Richard Scrushy are now in court over their activities with WorldCom and Health South. I think you're here because Major League Baseball is riddled with steroid problems and still hasn't sorted it out with their new regulations. I think you're here because the FDA is telling us that they can't really guarantee that they can protect us from all the drugs that are out there, the new drugs, the legal drugs. I think you're here because the FBI has just spent $170 million on a new computer system that isn't working. I think you're here because there's a lot of these things out there that have to do with scandals to the point where we say, well, thank heavens they're still the church. Point is, it's coming at us from all sides. And every one of these stories, if you think about it, really has to do with moral courage. Somewhere behind those stories, there was an individual who could have made a difference, who could have stood up and said, wait a minute, we don't do it this way, who didn't do that. And that's what I want to focus on with you here today. I want to focus on three things. I want to talk to you a bit about what moral courage is. I want to talk to you about why it matters so much, more than it has ever mattered, and I will try to make that case for you. And finally, I want to put this into the context for which you, Anne, have invited me, which is to talk about the whole question of information technology and the way in which ethics and information technology intersect in a tremendously potent mix that can carry us into all kinds of difficulty or into all kinds of glory, depending on how we sort it out. So let me start with just a few words about moral courage. Let me tell you a story. I want to tell you about an individual that I ran into whose name is Victor Pestov. I met 2 time zones east of Moscow in the Ural Mountains in 1998 when I was there visiting a place called Perm 36. Perm 36 is now better known as the Gulag Museum. You know, I think, about the Gulag Archipelago that Alexander Solzhenitsyn made famous in his novel. This network of camps, prison camps, spread all across the old Soviet Union. Started in 1946 by Stalin, and by the time they were destroyed in the late 90s, with only one of them remaining that wasn't bulldozed by the Soviets, and that's Perm 36. That's the one that's been made into the museum. By the time they had been destroyed, they were responsible for the Soviet government having killed 30 million of its own citizens. Now think about that number. That is 5 times the size of the Holocaust. That makes the loss of life in the tsunami look small. That turns the loss of life in 9/11 into a rounding error. We're talking about an immense tragedy that's gone on here that affected the lives of every single family, one way or the other, in the Soviet Union during that period. When you visit Perm 36, you go through 7 different fences to get there. Barbed wire, chain link, electric fence, cinder block, moats, all kinds of stuff. And you finally get in and you find yourself in little tiny cubicles where sitting on the bunks are the garments that the prisoners used to wear, nothing but a thin cotton pair of trousers and a thin long-sleeved shirt with maroon and gray stripes around them indicating that they were prisoners. You're in a room with an ill-fitted window with a heater on the wall, a radiator on the wall about the size of a laptop. That's what you've got against the raw Siberian winter. You get to exercise 45 minutes a day in a 9-foot by 9-foot by 9-foot high cubicle with barbed wire across the top. That's the open air exercise you get. Meals are bread and water with soup, such as it was, every second day. And you spend your days building, in those days, irons, domestic irons for ironing, for the consumer market, slave labor. Victor was in that camp. Victor spent 5 years there. Victor, you might say, was a charter member. The camp was opened in 1970, and he was there. He was sent there in 1970. So I asked him why. What was the story that took him there? Victor grew up in Sverdlovsk, which was, in the old days, Ekaterinburg, a city well known in Russian history for the assassination of the royal family. His mother was high in the KGB. His father ran a major hospital in town. They were, in other words, living as well as you can live in the old Soviet Union. They were a family that sort of had it all in that sense, in the provincial cities. Victor grew up there, and during the celebration, the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, 50 years afterwards, in 1967, he was being told, as all the Soviets were, that the Soviet man is perfect. Everything is taken care of. There is no homelessness. Everyone lives well and all of that. And he told me he went to visit some friends of friends, and they went into a building in the middle of the city and went down to the basement to find where these people lived. And then they went down to the basement below that basement. And then they went down to the basement below that basement, to a dirt floor, damp, airless, no windows, no light, and that's where a family was living. And he realized something wasn't right here. So he began listening at great peril, given his family connections. He began listening to Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, try to figure out what was going on. He said, I was 19 at that time, and I was working in a candy factory. And over the breaks in the middle of the day, I would listen to Radio Free Europe, and I began to hear about the Prague Spring, what was going on in 1968, as students and others led the revolution in Czechoslovakia. And then on August 20th, he heard about the Soviet tanks rolling into Prague to put an end to the Prague Spring. And he said to his friends and to his brother, we've got to do something about this. Well, what do you do in the Soviet Union if you want to take a stand? They decided to become pamphleteers. That doesn't sound like much. But think about the old Soviet Union, where nobody read much because there wasn't much to read. All the stuff you had was dictated to you by the government. It was the official line. And when you found something that was real, when you found a piece of writing that was authentic and told you something that mattered, you snatched it up and you read it. So they became pamphleteers. That, by the way, doesn't mean you go out and buy a Xerox machine. It doesn't mean you buy a printing press. None of that was available. You couldn't even buy a mimeograph machine. What they could buy was a second-hand typewriter and a lot of paper and a lot of carbon paper. And to make an edition of pamphlets, they would type them 6 at a time with the carbon paper and run through the same thing again and again until they had this precious stack of 200 sheets. And that was the easy part. Then the question is, how do you distribute them? You obviously don't stand on the streets of Sverdlovsk saying, pamphlets against the government, come get them. For a while they tried throwing them out of upper-story windows when parades were going by until the police chased them through the attics and nearly caught them. And he had said to his brother and his friend, I think we have about a year before we get caught, maybe less. They were willing to do it anyway. And he told me some of the ways they found to distribute the pamphlets. He talked about some of his fellow pamphleteers crawling into the trolley yards late at night when the cars had been washed and the dew had settled on the top of the rounded steel surfaces. And they'd climb up on the cars and they would stick the pamphlets down into the wet surface of the top of the car. And in the morning when the cars went out through the streets and the sun came out and the wind began to blow, the pamphlets would suddenly dry up and fly off here and there, and nobody knew where they came from. But when they hit the ground, people were there to pick them up and hand them around to others and learn about what was going on in Prague. He told about taking damp bits of bread and climbing out through the windows to the mansard roofs, the steep slate roofs in the city, and sticking the pamphlets to the roof with little bits of damp bread, and in the morning the pigeons would come up and eat the bread, and the pamphlet would slide off into the street. And by then, of course, they were long gone, the Victor and his friends. But they built, at one point, a particularly large edition of pamphlets and needed help. So they recruited somebody else to distribute pamphlets with them. And that somebody betrayed them. Victor's mother lost her job immediately and never worked again. His father was demoted to an assistant X-ray technician in the same hospital where he had been in charge. And Victor was sent off to concentration camp, to the death camp, really, for 5 years. I asked him what he thought about that. What was going on in his mind as he was doing that? And he said, since it all happened to his family, since it all happened because of me, I felt very guilty. But he also felt the enormity of his purpose, his moral purpose. What you're fighting for, what you're fighting against, he said, was the idea that, quote, someone will think for you, someone will make decisions for you. He said he was fighting really for the principle that a person should be master of his own fate and there should be one law for everyone. And I asked him finally what made him most proud. He thought for a moment and he said, I believe I did the right things. I wasn't silent. I was saying and doing what I had to do. There was a very small contribution of mine to the fact that the communists were pushed out of power. That's what made it worth it for him. Would you agree that the story I've just told you is in fact a story of moral courage? Yeah. Then the question is, why? What makes it so? What is it that causes you to hear that story and say, yes, that's moral courage? What has to happen for it to be that? I think there are 3 things that have to go on. I think it's got to be a story that involves significant, recognized risk, real danger. And Victor would have known that. The stories in the Samizdat press and the underground grapevine, the stories about the gulags were all around. That wasn't secret in the old Soviet Union. And he knew that people were dying regularly and just not coming back from those camps. Second thing, I think there has to be a willingness to endure that risk. You've got to look at the risk and say, yes, it's there, and then be willing to take the stand and say, yes, I will step up and do this. And third, I think those 2 things have to be in the service of a higher moral and ethical principle. If the principle isn't there, all you have is what we would normally refer to as physical courage, recognition of risk, willingness to endure it. That's bungee jumping, right? That's extreme sports. That's all kinds of things that we recognize as physical courage. But when it's done in the service of principle, it becomes moral courage. Think about what happens, by the way, if you remove any of these other two things. Suppose you have a real willingness to endure for the sake of principle, but with no clue about how dangerous it is. You just don't get it. You're just sort of blindly going along. What do we call that? I don't know. Stupidity? Foolhardiness? Naivete? Something like that. And there's an obvious word for the other option. What happens when you've got a tremendous sense of risk for the sake of principle, and you have a clear look at it and run the other way? What do you call that? That's cowardice, right? Moral courage has to have these three things all together. But there's another way to think about this business of the principle as well. Think about moral courage simply as the courage to be moral, the courage to be ethical. And that, of course, leads to the question, well, what do you mean by ethical? What do you mean by moral? What kind of values are we talking about? And here's one point where the Institute for Global Ethics has probably done more research than anyone else in this small targeted area of trying to figure out what people mean by ethical, what values matter around the world. I won't go into the research in detail. Let me just give you the sort of bottom line of it, which is that in every country that we visit, and we've done this work in a number of different countries, and through whatever methodology we use, whether we're working with Gallup and doing surveys, whether we're working in focus groups or seminars or individual interviews, if you ask people what are the values that most matter, you don't hear a huge array of different things. You hear them talk about 5 core values. When I tell you what they are, these will not strike you as surprising. This is not rocket science. It's pretty obvious. They will talk to you about honesty, or truth, or integrity. The word is not as important as the idea. And by the way, these are not in hierarchical order. This is a constellation of different ideas. They'll talk to you about honesty. They'll talk to you about responsibility. They'll talk to you about respect. They'll talk about fairness. And they'll talk about compassion. Get beyond that 5, you'll hear lots of different values from different cultures. But within that core of 5, we're finding it very difficult to see any statistically valid differentiation between groups. What I mean by that is that ask men and women, they've got the same values. Ask people who speak English as their native language and people who speak some other language, they've got the same values. And most important, I think, ask people who say, I come from a strong religious tradition. And ask people who say, I've got no religious tradition whatsoever. And they've got the same values. Now, this gets to the point, in other words, this question of the core shared values that we have. This makes the point for me that values is really what it is that makes us human. We are human because we share this set of values. I checked that point, by the way, at a meeting that I was at where Graham Falk, my colleague here, raise your paw, Graham, so people know you're here. Right. Graham is the executive director of the Institute for Global Ethics. He and I were at a meeting that Gorbachev convened in San Francisco a few years ago, doing a survey of the people who were there. Clearly not a random sample survey. People who come to a meeting Gorbachev convenes are not like most people. But nevertheless, they were thought leaders and an interesting bunch of people, and we got this same set back, the same set of values. At that meeting was Jane Goodall, the woman who knows, some of you may know her work. She knows more about chimpanzees than anybody in the world. She had already said to the group that chimps and humans share 98% of their DNA. We are, in other words, 98% like chimps. I know some people, and so do you, who are 100% like chimps, but for the most part, we are 98% like chimps. So the question is, what's in the other 2%? And I said to Jane, do chimps have ethics? She thought about that a while, and she said, I don't think so. Ethics, she said, I think requires a capacity to use an abstract language. Now, chimps have a language. They can talk. They can say, let's eat, let's go to war, etc. But they can't talk about truth and fairness and responsibility. And I said to her, well, so what? Do they act it out? Do they act on the basis of these values? And she said, every once in a while we see somebody come to our center in Tanzania and they think they're seeing a chimp do some marvelously altruistic act. They think they are seeing, when the mother chimp dies to save the life of her young, they think they are seeing ethics in practice. But that, said Jane, that's not ethics, that's genetics. That's the desire of every living species to protect its own genetic line, even at the expense of the elder generation. Animals don't do that. The real question is, does this mother chimp over here die to save the life of that little chimp over there, between whom there is no blood connection whatsoever? And the answer is hardly ever. Occasional stories that we've seen recently, ape saves man from drowning in zoo or something like that, right? But those are the strange ones. For the most part, animals don't die for ideas. People die for ideas. That's what the American Revolution was all about. That's what the shot heard round the world was all about. Or remember that joke that came up a while ago when Sputnik went into orbit and there was this picture of a bunch of contented cows floating around in space inside a space vehicle, and somebody said the herd shot round the world. Anyway, people die for those kinds of ideas, for good ideas, and they die for bad ideas. And in a sense, that's what terrorism is all about. But the fact is, we don't die simply to save our bloodlines. There is something else motivating us. At bottom, there is this core of values that drives people forward. Now, if in fact there is a set of values that underlie what we're thinking about, that begins to explain where ethical issues come from. And they come from one of two things. You either have a value and you violate it, and ethics is all about right versus wrong. You say honesty matters. Here's somebody being dishonest. And clearly that's what ethics must be. And we've all been taught that. We've all been taught, oh yes, ethics, that's about right versus wrong. But far more important, we run into questions also where two of our core values come into conflict one with another. They're both right, and we can't do both at the same time. And ethics becomes a matter of right versus right. Those are the tough decisions. Those are the decisions that all of you students especially, as you move into your professional careers, will be encountering. In fact, let me put it this way. If you find in 5 or 10 years that the toughest issues you're facing are right versus wrong, questions of compliance, I would suggest to you you've got the wrong staff, because that stuff ought to get sorted out sort of down there. The tough issues, the really challenging management issues for you, are going to be issues of right versus right, where you can build a powerful case for both, and you can't do both. Go back to Victor's example. Think about the right versus right question that he faced right at the beginning. It is absolutely right, and you can build a powerful moral case for saying family matters. You have got to do whatever sustains and supports the rest of your family. And you can build a powerful moral case for saying, wait a minute, look what's happening in my country right now. I have got to take a stand. Something must be done here, even though it will lead to the destruction of family. That's right versus right. Those are the kinds of challenges. Victor faced a tough world. And Victor had the moral courage to stand up to that and say, I've got to make a difference, and to move forward on that basis. Victor faced a tough world, but so do we. And the question then is, why is Victor's story so important? And this is where I want to move to the second part of my discussion here. Why does ethics matter now as it has not mattered ever in the past? Let me try to build that case for you. It's really a case that has to do with, and this is why I'm so grateful that, Anne, you're here and have put this particular topic in front of us. It has to do with the relationship of technology to the rest of the world. That may sound strange to you, but let me build that case. Imagine what it is like, think if you will, about the story, which I will not go into in any detail, about what happened at Chernobyl in 1986, when a couple of unethical engineers making decisions against the moral standard that they should have known was important created the largest industrial accident in the history of the world. Think about the fact that had they done that in the late 19th century, what they would have blown up would be some kind of a coal-fired manufacturing facility, and it would not have been a world-class disaster. Think about the Exxon Valdez. Think about what's required for a drunken captain to run a ship aground and produce, in its own way, a world-class environmental disaster. He could not have done that in the 19th century. There was no ship big enough to do it. Think about the Barings Bank. A 200-year-old bank, deposits from the Queen of England, helped to fund the Napoleonic Wars, brought to bankruptcy in 3 weeks by the activities of a single 29-year-old trader named Nicholas Leeson, trading derivatives on the Nikkei exchange from his base in Singapore with an intensely complex computer system in front of him and this is crucial, a flattened management structure that put him in charge of both doing the trades and then reporting on them. 3 weeks, bankruptcy. At the point at which Victor went into the camp in 1970, that could not have happened. The technology simply was not there to allow Nicholas Leeson to do that kind of thing. Think about the love bug computer virus. Remember that from a couple of years ago? Launched, we now know, by a couple of kids in the Philippines. Not terrorists, not kids out to line their pockets, not trying to make a lot of money, just kids pushing the envelope, the way kids have been pushing the envelope for years. What do you do if you're a kid on the streets of Manila in 1970 and you want to push the envelope? I don't know, you chase cats, right? You break windows, you steal hubcaps. Now you've got a computer keyboard. And now when you sit down to push the envelope, you create $10 billion worth of global damage. And finally, think about the last and saddest case. Think about 9/11. Think about what had to happen there for a couple of individuals, a handful of individuals, to take control of a technology. Big aluminum tubes in the air filled with people and filled with explosive fuel that simply had not existed in the decades prior to that. What do all these have in common? One simple thing. We are moving into an age where our technology leverages our ethics in ways we have never seen in the past. So it is now possible for a single unethical decision by somebody way down in the ranks of the organization to produce world-class disaster. These things simply could not have happened 20, 30, 40 years ago because of the scale of our technologies and because of the fact that we have taken these technologies away from the great big boxes that IBM used to put them in and said, here's your computer room, right? And we've put them into the BlackBerry. And we've said, here's your computer, sir. And you can do everything there that IBM used to be able to do. The capacity for mayhem has increased in all kinds of ways because of this leveraging of the technology. If that is so, if we're in this situation where the single unethical activities of a few individuals can create almost instant disaster around the world by the technological leveraging, the amplifying, the megaphoning effect. If that's so, then the next logical question is, well, how are we doing? How are we doing as we educate the next generation to deal with these questions? I see a lot of data coming across my desk at the Institute for Global Ethics, the same kind of stuff that, Mike, that you see here at the Center for Business Ethics, about the propensity for students to cheat. The latest figures that we're seeing Donald McCabe at the Center for Academic Integrity at Duke University, this is based on a survey done in 2001, is that 74% of high school students admit to serious cheating on tests. 72% of them admit to serious cheating on written assignments. By the time they get to college, that rises to about 75%, with about a third of them being repetitive, regular, industrial-strength, weapons-grade cheaters. Right? Serious, perpetual cheating. That's just the way we do it. That's how it happens. That's how it works. There's a phenomenon he's also noted, which he calls cut-and-paste plagiarism, where you're smart enough not to take a whole paper off the internet, but you're happy to take a sentence here, a sentence there, weave them together. Don't bother with attribution. Build the thing as though you had written it yourself. In 1999, McCabe's surveys found that 10% of students were doing cut-and-paste plagiarism. By 2001, 41% were admitting to doing it. And when he asked them, do you think it's serious? 2/3 of them said, no, it doesn't matter. Cheating, it's not a big deal. It's okay. I've always thought, Mike, maybe you and I should team up on this and see if we could find a foundation to do this. Send a group of students who think it's okay, it doesn't matter. Send them to Chernobyl. Have them talk to the people there whose lives were destroyed by people who thought cheating really doesn't matter. It isn't important. My point? What we're getting at is the fact that if ethics is as serious as we have suggested that it is, if in fact the real risk is that we may not survive the 21st century with the ethics of the 20th century, given the capacity for this leveraging. If it's that serious, and this now is the way we are educating the next generation, especially in the high schools, the real question is how do we get there from here? How do we make a serious difference? Now, there are certain ways that we can do this, of course. There is, as some of you may know, a website called schoolsucks.com, where for $30 you can buy whatever essay you'd like. But be careful, because there is also a website called turnitin.com, which the faculty uses to detect plagiarism, because all turnitin.com does is take every word in your essay and search it against every document on the web, billions of documents, and come up with any set of 6 or 8 or 10 words that are the same, and you're nailed. So it's an interesting standoff. It's the Christians versus the gladiators out there. You know, schoolsucks.com versus turnitin.com, and we'll see who wins. Why are we in this situation? Let me share with you, I'm going to show you my first slide at this point. It is, of course, a virtual slide because I didn't bring slides. But does anybody really feel the need of seeing yet one more PowerPoint? No, you'll understand this when I show it to you up here. It's a graph. I mean, slides are either a graph like this or a graph like this, right? This one is a graph like that, right? And it's starting over here in 1968, as you can see. And over there, by the year 2000, it ends. It starts at 42%, and it rises to about 76%. It is based on studies done by the American Council of Education of interviews with incoming college and university freshmen. Major studies, major surveys they do every second year, well-known surveys, in which they ask a whole battery of questions. This one I'm showing you, for this one, the question is looking into having the students look into their own future. How important is it to you to be very, and the word very is in there, very well off financially? 42% in 1968 and 76% by the time you get to the year 2000. Keep that in mind while I show you the next slide, which is now a graph going the other direction. You know, it starts very high over here and ends up actually at 42%, the place where the other one started. The question here is, how important is it to you to develop a meaningful philosophy of life, starting in the high 80s and ending up at 42%? For those of you in the audience who are about my age, we've got some very interesting thinking to do, because we tend to think that what's going on in our educational environments is all about is pretty much the kind of thing that we went through back when we were in school. When we were in school, there was this understanding that developing a meaningful philosophy of life was an idea shared by at least 3/4 or 4/5 of our friends. That appears not to be the case these days. It appears that we're talking about something where the crossing of these two curves in the course of a single generation has been a profound change. I have no quarrel, and let me say this right clear. There are two things I want to say. First of all, this whole question of cheating is not the fault of the students. Don't blame the students. We are the generation that has set the parameters. We have established the standards. We have failed to make the case that cheating really matters. And we are the culpable ones, and we've got a lot of work to do. Second, I have no quarrel with students who say, I need to be financially well off. I know what it costs to get an education these days. I know the kinds of loan repayments that are out there. My only concern is, what is it that we're trading in order to get there? What are we giving up in order to say, yes, I'll be financially well off? Think of it this way. There they are, students who have said, I want to be financially well off. I don't really want to develop a philosophy of life. They've made it. They've got tons of money, and they've retired. What are they going to do all day? I mean, are they condemned to roam the malls of America looking for stuff to buy? Because that's the only thing going on in their heads? That's not what life is all about. It's about something far more important than that. It is about meaning. It is about values. It is about relationships. And that's where it seems to me we have got to take this entire enterprise of education. And that, by the way, is the real reason that I'm here today. I'm here today because you are in the presence in this program at Bentley College, in the Center for Business Ethics. You are in the presence of one of the legends, Mike Hoffman, of our age. This is an astonishing thing that has happened here, to turn the ship of the educational enterprise in the direction of saying ethics really matters. Ethics is core. Ethics is not some fringe idea out here on the edges that you can have or not. If it's an option, you can bolt it on if you'd like. Mike's recognition that this is central and his willingness to stick with that for lo these 29, did you say, years? That is extraordinary. And that's what is beginning to make the difference at these few pockets of illumination here. So bear in mind, I am not talking to you students when I'm about you students when I'm talking about this kind of thing. You've got a different take on this, or you'd be here today and you wouldn't be in this program. But let me take you finally then to the whole question about how this relates to the question of the information technologies that we're facing. My concern, as I have suggested in the title of this lecture, which has to do with moral courage and digital distrust, we are entering into a situation where, unless we are careful, we are going to see the entire enterprise of innovation and invention brought to naught, stopped in its tracks by public fear. Let me put it this way. Unless we have the moral courage to radically restructure the relationship of ethics and technology, we're at the risk of losing this entire activity of innovation in a tsunami of public mistrust. Let me build the case for that. And I want to do it by going back to the rather peaceful days of the year 2000 before 9/11 and all of that hit us. And I want to remind you of a line of reasoning brought before us in a fascinating article, which has since had a lot of criticism, I admit that, a fascinating article by Bill Joy, co-founder of Sun Microsystems, in Wired magazine in April 2000, where Joy was writing under the heading of Why the Future Doesn't Need Us. And the reason the future doesn't need us, he said, is because we are now at the intersection of three remarkable technologies: genetic technology, robotics, and nanotechnology, making things tiny, right? As these three technologies come together, he said, we are facing an increase in the speed of computing, the computing speed of at least a trillion-fold over the next several decades. As he pointed out, a trillion-fold increase is the difference between the explosive power of a matchstick and a hydrogen bomb. That's what it means to have something that goes a trillion times faster than it used to. He made the case that as speed increases, cost will drop radically, that computers, and we're already beginning to see this, computers will be as commonplace as lead pencils. Computers will be built into everything. And in fact, nobody in the future will be charging for computers. The computer is going to be free. You'll have to buy the software, and that's where companies will make the money. But they'll toss in the machinery free because it is so inexpensive to, these days we say, to make. By that time, under Bill Joy's scenario, we would say to grow. We're talking about genetic technologies, remember. At that point, robotics kicks in a very interesting way. And we begin to find ourselves surrounded by robots who are so intelligent, so capable of doing everything we're doing, so willing to do the dirty work for us, that in the end, most of us really don't need to work. And that doesn't mean productivity is going to go down the tubes and there's going to be no money. Quite the reverse. There's going to be amplitudes of stuff, according to Bill Joy. We'll have everything we need. It's just that we're not going to have to work to do it. That raises very interesting moral questions, as I said, about what we do all day if we just sit around doing nothing, about how we get some sense of an importance to our identity. But it raises even bigger questions than that. Suppose we got all these robots running around doing the stuff that we now do, and it's beginning to dawn on the robots that humans are really a very inefficient thing to have around. I mean, look, we spend about a third of our time in actual productive work, right? And the rest of it, we're either resting or recharging ourselves or something like that. We get sick. We get all kinds of problems. It takes us years. I mean, it takes us about 20 years to get up to speed to understand what we're supposed to do. And then we have this blip of a working life, and then we sort of tail off for a while. Robots don't do that. They come up to speed just like that. They work 24 hours a day, and they just keep going. And when you finally build the next generation up, you retire that one, you blow them up, you get rid of them, nobody worries about it because they're not human, nobody cares, and you just build the next generation. Why, said Joy, will the robots need us? Why will they want to have us around? Now, this is an intriguing line of reasoning. There are various arguments you can array against it. You can make the point that, in fact, without a conscience, what is there that will keep the robots thinking and moving forward and all of that? Why will they want to keep doing what they're doing? Why don't they just take the easy way out and so forth? Nevertheless, it's a very scary and interesting scenario. I heard Bill Joy speak at a conference up in Camden, Maine a while ago. And he raised at that point, based on this line of reasoning, what I take to be the central and Faustian conundrum. He said, are there things that we should not know? Knowledge that we should not seek, inventions that we should never pursue. And here's a quote. Even if the search for truth is our highest value, there must be some exceptions. It is not always desirable to know everything. In other words, we are creating this new world. Do we want to do it? Do we want to know these things? I realize that what I have just said is a stunning and radical and revolutionary statement to make on the campus of any academic institution, where basically our article of faith is that knowledge is in and of itself a good thing, and the pursuit of knowledge must be put above everything else. And here comes one of our leading thinkers in technology and saying, wait a minute, the future is sufficiently dangerous that in fact there may be things we ought not know. Now, my concern about all of this is that when this kind of thinking escapes from the academy and gets out into the public square, and it then gets replayed back to Congress, and it then develops the kinds of fear factors that are out there, about all the new things that are happening. The question is, will there finally be something that grows up, a public backlash that says, if this is where technology is taking us, we don't want to go there, stop. And you may say to yourself, well, they can't stop that. I mean, how do you stop this momentum, this thing that's just keeping on going, this enterprise that's happening, this tremendous innovation? I'll tell you how you stop it. You stop it with tax policy. That's what Sarbanes-Oxley is all about. For years, we went along with Sarbanes-Oxley in the background, not yet made into law, with all kinds of pressures to have it made, but always resisted successfully by the lobbyists. Until finally, in the aftermath of Enron and WorldCom and Global Crossings and all the rest of that, finally in that summer, when the Gallup Institute, with the Gallup surveys reported that more than 60% of Americans said in surveys, there is not a single number coming out of the corporate world that I can trust. In other words, when the distrust was so great, finally Sarbanes-Oxley just roared right over the opposition. And that's sad. It's a bad piece of legislation. There's all kinds of problems with it. But it's there. And it is beginning to make a difference for good. It is also beginning to restrain all kinds of potential that would have been better in terms of enterprise and innovation. Take another example. Look at what's happening to charitable foundations right now. Charitable foundations, the big ones, Ford, Carnegie, and all of that, and the rest of the thousands of others that are out there, are under serious criticism in the Senate Finance Committee because of questions of the equivalent of insider trading, questions of self-dealing and paying oneself out of the foundation and all that sort of stuff. Now, foundations at this point are required to pay out the equivalent of 5% of their corpus. And that just about works. You can do it and still have the corpus continue to grow, and you can still move forward and continue to make grants, continue to support things like the Center for Business Ethics, the Institute for Global Ethics. All you have to do is change that number, and you can put foundations right out of business. Change it to 12%. Force foundations to spend more than they have earned each year. And very quickly, that foundation goes out of business. Somebody else can start a new foundation, and that's fine, but it too will go out of business. You can do a lot of stuff with tax policy, including you can say to the great innovators popping up in Silicon Valley and on Route 128, you can say to them, go off into your garages and propagate and grow rich and all of this kind of stuff. Do what Bill Hewlett and David Packard did, just in your little tiny back shops. By the way, there's just one thing that's changed. We will tax you at 95% of your income when you finally sell the company. But otherwise, go ahead and do it. That's pretty much the end of innovation. And all it takes is a public sufficiently frightened by what's going on here to say, wow, this is dangerous. We don't know what's happening. We've got to put a stop to that. So here is my real challenge to all of us in this room today. What are we doing about that? Are we making any effort to rebuild the public trust around these kinds of questions as we head off into technological leveraging that is going to make Chernobyl look like small potatoes? As we head off into situations where single individuals will have this trillion-fold computing power right there in their BlackBerries to do whatever it is that they want to do. A proposal for you. Here's what I think has to happen. I think we have to finally build some form of an ethical futurism structure. We have got to be able to look over the horizon at the ethical issues that we are creating as we develop new technologies and say, yes, we can foresee this. We're not waiting to have it catch up with us. Think about the Human Genome Project. When it was founded in 1990 and finally ended in 2003, when it was founded by James D. Watson, he insisted that 5% of the funding go into what was called the ELSI questions, the ethical, legal, and social implications of the technology. He said, don't wait till the technology's out there. Don't wait till we have finally built the map of these 3 billion chemical pairs that make up our DNA. Try to imagine what the ethical questions are going to be before they hit, so that we are there, we're prepared, we're ready, we're getting there long before they do. And he was asking questions like, who should have access to genetic information? How does a person's genetic information affect society's perception of that person? What is to be considered acceptable diversity? How far are we going to take this question of diversity? Where's the line between medical treatment and enhancement? Or how will genetically modified food technologies affect the developing nation's dependence on the West? These are tough, interesting problems that we could have waited and suddenly seen, my gosh, all the developing countries are trying to buy these genetically developed seeds from Monsanto, and they can't because the price is too high. They are absolutely dependent on the West in ways they've never been in the past. We have created this monster, and we never saw it coming. All Watson was doing was saying, see it coming. Watch and see what's happening. A couple of examples of why we want to do that. We're now developing, as you know, radio frequency ID tags that are going to take this little thing, I'm sure I've got one on the back of the book here somewhere, this little product code here, and replace it with an electronic chip. This book will have a chip. My eyeglasses will have a chip. Your sweater will have a chip. Your pen will have a chip. And it's going to record all the information in this thing. And as you go to the supermarket, you're not going to stop in a checkout line. You're going to put all your stuff in a basket, and you're going to walk out the door. And as you walk out the door, it's going to read everything in that basket, and it's going to know who bought it, and it's going to send it back to your credit card, and you'll be billed, and that's fine. Think what that does about the capacity to know who bought what, where, and when. Think what that does to privacy. And you can say, what a good thing. Gosh, if we'd only known that, if we'd only been able to see that there was this guy in Oklahoma who was buying tons of fertilizer, and he had never been a farmer, and he had never had any intention of being a farmer, and in the end, he blew up the Murrah office building, and his name was Timothy McVeigh. Wouldn't we have liked to know that? We could have nipped that terrorism in the bud. But if we can do that to Timothy McVeigh, somebody can do that to you. If you have a challenging medical problem, do you want your employer to know exactly what medicines you're buying and how frequently before they hire you, your prospective employer? So they surreptitiously look at a list and say, you're not really a good risk. And of course, I can't tell you that because you'd cost us a fortune, so I'm just going to have to say, sorry, we've chosen somebody else. What are we going to do with this kind of information? My point is we don't have to wait until we find these things out there in public making these differences. We can foresee that. And we have an opportunity and we have an obligation for that kind of foresight, it seems to me. We must begin right now to take charge of the ethics of our technologies. We cannot let them just happen. There has got to be serious foresight about that if we want this sense of innovation to continue. Because without it, we're in a situation where the public is beginning to feel that sense of both delight with the technologies and dread about what could happen. And the dread, the outrage, will finally be capable of stopping this sort of innovation unless we're serious about this movement. Now, last thing. What is the possibility that a small room full of people like this can actually make that happen? Are you sitting there saying, oh, a big idea, but that's not something I can do anything about? If that's the way you're feeling, let me end with just an analogy that may put this into a slightly different perspective. A story, once again. Back when I was with the Christian Science Monitor, I found myself on one occasion interviewing for a series on education, interviewing a number of black professional men who had made it in our culture. They had come, two of them that I talked to, from some of the worst ghetto areas in America. And as I said to them, how come you weren't gunned down on a street corner at age 18 as statistically you should have been, given where you came from? And the answer they each gave me was a variant of the same thing. They said, well, it was old Mrs. So-and-so in the 4th grade. She turned me around. She really made the difference. And I said, wait a minute. You've already told me about your dozens of other teachers you had, all of them terrible. And they said, yeah, that's right. And you've already told me about your extended dysfunctional family where nobody worked and all the wrong examples were set. And they said, yeah, that's right. And you've already told me about your hundreds of friends, many of them now dead, many in jail. None of them setting good examples. And they said, yeah, that's right. And you're telling me that one woman made the difference? And I said, yeah, that's what I'm telling you. The power of a single example is enormous. Now, we know that. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But think about the obverse of that also. Why is it not true that we can have people who come from wonderful backgrounds, terrific families, great friends, the sort of support of a teaching community that's just wonderful, and all it takes is some rotten teacher in the 4th grade to turn them forever to a life of crime? We don't see that happen. The question is, why not? Why is it that the good example seems to cut through and make a difference? The single good example, in ways that the single bad example doesn't necessarily do. To answer that question, I want you to perform an experiment, if you would, when you get home tonight. Find a closet in your house that's been closed up for a very long time. Dark as pitch in there. The darkness in that closet is serious, tough, real darkness, right? Had a long time to fester. Take a candle, turn out the lights in the room outside that closet, light the candle, and open the door of the closet. And watch to see how this ugly, thick darkness comes pouring out and puts out your candle. It has never once happened in the history of the world, has it? Every time you light the candle illumines the darkness. The darkness does not put out the candle. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. But the question is, why? What is the relation of light to dark that causes this to happen? And the simple answer is, darkness is not the opposite of light. Darkness is the absence of light. And yet, most of the metaphors for the world are not built on a presence and an absence. They're built on opposites. Think about the way we think about the world. We think about hot and cold as being opposites. We think about plus and minus charges in chemistry and in electricity as being opposites. We think about north and south poles in magnetism as being opposites. And then we think about light and dark as being opposites because, there's about as much daylight as there is night in the course of a year. If you add it all up, they're pretty much opposites, aren't they? And then we take that and we think in general about light and dark, not just daylight and night, but light and dark. Say, oh yeah, they're opposites. And then we import that entire metaphor into the realm of ethics. And we say, see, it's like light and dark, good and bad. They're opposites. What if, just what if, bad is not the opposite of good? What if bad is the absence of good? Do you begin to understand now why it is possible for a single teacher in 4th grade to turn around that entire life? Because she was not up against the collected forces of malevolence that had come down through the centuries and were evenly balanced against the forces of good. She, in fact, was simply putting in place a presence where there had been nothing. If that's true, then the kind of work that this Center for Business Ethics is doing, and the kind of work that each one of us is capable of doing, is fully capable of transforming the world. We have that capacity. We are not up against it in terms of all the evil that's out there. And we can make, and if my argument stands, we must make everything, every stand we can for the moral courage to turn that around and to really put the good in place out there where the bad wasn't ever. And that will make the difference in the 21st century. Thank you. Well, look, I was thinking... I'm sorry, yes. The question is, a powerful metaphor at the end, but in fact, isn't darkness palpable? Isn't there something out there that we need to address? Yeah, in the way that how things are so often done. We do the things we do because of the mental conceptions that we have about them. And if we basically build the world on a structure of opposites, we will see a world built in opposites, and we will behave that way. That was the kind of thinking. I was thinking about this in the last couple of weeks as the 60th anniversary of Auschwitz came up. That was the kind of thinking, of course, that made Auschwitz happen. My wife and I visited Auschwitz a few years ago. And I remember the real takeaway I had from that as we're taken through, and seeing the rooms where the Jews were incarcerated, and the piles of eyeglasses and the piles of shoes that were taken from them. You're then taken down through the gas chambers. You're taken into the crematorium after that, underground. You finally come up and when you come up, you're on the outside of the big perimeter fence. And at that point, the guide points into the trees about a block away to the gabled brick roof of a pleasant-looking 3-story house. And that, she said, is where the Nazi commandant lived. That's where he went home every evening and played with his dog on the lawn and had fun with his kids and talked with his wife and invited people over for dinner and read his poetry and listened to music, and then went back to his day job of killing Jews. Now, you look at something like that and you say, how on earth can that happen, especially if, in fact, we're talking about this core of shared values? Well, oddly enough, and this may strike you as a shocking idea, oddly enough, that Nazi commandant shared the same values that you and I have. He had a clear sense of honesty within his little circle. He was clear about responsibility. If he invited somebody to dinner, I imagine he was there. He didn't blow that off. He understood what it meant to respect people in the chain of command. He was fair with those under him. He was probably compassionate with his kids, his dog, and his wife. Problem is that set of values didn't even extend a block away from his residence. The circle within which he put those values was so shrunken, so tiny, that it didn't include all of those people that he was then decimating as he went on with his job during the day. What we're seeing here is a capacity for humans to operate within a moral perimeter. Yes, a set of values, but it only extends this far. And beyond that, I don't really have any moral obligations. The mafia have wonderful values. You've got to be responsible if you're going to be a good hitman. You've got to be fair if you're going to run an organization where people get paid off in the ways they get paid off. But that's all within the family. Outside the family, it's all fair game, and I know I owe no moral obligation. I'm under no illusion, in other words, that there is this immense potency of what says and in fact is a real darkness. This sense that evil appears to be something very present, very real, and that we must take against. I'm under no illusion that compliance in a corporate world matters, that we have got to teach people the difference between right and wrong and hold firmly to that sense that this is wrong and must not be done. But I'm also under no illusion that if your only metaphor for the world is one that says it's all about right and wrong, it's all about black and white, it's all about what's good and what isn't, that so quickly leads you to a legalistic structure that in the end all you're doing is forcing people to obey rather than saying to them, we want you to understand what this is all about. We don't want obedience because we're pushing you. We want obedience because there's an understanding of what ethics really is, and it is drawing us all forward. And my conviction is that as it draws us all forward, it draws us into a world where we come to understand that there is a tremendous power in the goodness of individuals and in the goodness of organizations. And those organizations that are beginning to glimpse that, I am convinced, are beginning to make a real dent in the way the world works, and they're beginning to see that goodness fall to their bottom line. They're beginning to understand that this, too, is not rocket science. And that if you want somebody, if you're a major Fortune 500 corporation, if you want them to continue working with you, you'll do good. Just the way you would want somebody to treat you well if it's the corner dry cleaner. I mean, look, how many times are you going to go to the dry cleaner and have them tear off your buttons and get the thing back 3 weeks late covered with mud before you say, sorry, I'm not coming here anymore? How often would you be working with the major corporations if, in fact, what's going on is behavior that strikes you as being patently unethical? There's too much choice out there now. There's too many opportunities to work in other ways. In other words, you've gotten me started, sorry. The point is, there are any number of reasons out there to suggest that the goodness of what we're doing is, in fact, a real power, and in fact is a far larger power than what is coming at it.
I'm intrigued by what you said about public distrust of the advance of technology, and I'm thinking now about the use of embryonic research. And what it seems to be stalled around a religious notion of not destroying human life. But I wonder if there isn't something underlying that's more like underlying the inability to get this thing rolling, that's more like a public distrust of where this technology is going to take us. So put off to the side for the moment the religious objection. And I'm just wondering how much public distrust of where this would go is really the problem facing us with the embryonic research.
I think it really is. And there I think you want to take this back to the Frankenfoods debate, the genetically modified foods, which absolutely caught the food industry flat-footed. Sadly enough, because that's perfectly foreseeable. If you had any willingness to combine the principles of future studies with the principles of moral philosophy, and try to figure out what the ethical issues were going to be over the horizon once you put this in place, you could have seen that coming years ago. And you wouldn't have to be backpedaling all over Europe the way Monsanto is trying to do now as they try to get hold of this debate that's just gotten way out of hand. Right? I think there's something to that in the embryonic stem cell research issues as well. And I think in part because we're watching what's happened over the years as things that have been promised haven't really worked out quite the way we had thought. We're not quite sure what to do right now with nuclear power, right? Largely because we don't know what to do with the stuff that's left over. And nobody ever talked to us about that in the old days when we were building these things. And nobody ever really talks to us these days about the fact that, okay, you're buying this car, this mass of stuff. What are you going to do with it 10 years from now? Where's it going to go? And, we just now, just in the last few years, come to the clear understanding in the environmental movement that there is no away where you can throw it, right? Away is here. And with that kind of thing resonating in our minds, then we say, no, wait a minute, is this where we want to go? Think, if you will, I hate to say this in the presence of my friend from Verizon, think about how much we didn't think about the development of cell phones and now the development of camera phones and the ethical issues that surround all of that, right? It's nice that we can track in a kind of a GPS technology, we can track the presence of a cell phone to the point of saying, I know where the terrorist is in Afghanistan who's using the cell phone. And by the way, once we let them know that we could do that, they stopped using cell phones. But nobody really sat down and said, this thing in my hand, I gave it to you, sorry. This thing in my hand is actually a detonator. And you wire it in just right into a backpack of explosives in Madrid. And you put it on a plane, and you can set it off from anywhere in the world by just dialing that number. You're not local. You're out of there, and there it goes. Now, we don't have to think very much about that and about what's going on with camera phones, right? The problem, as I see it, with the camera phone debate, and the way that we haven't really thought about that, you've got millions of people out there taking pictures on city streets, right? Suppose we had some way to data bank all of those pictures. As I suspect we can now, if we were really to ask and get an honest answer from the intelligence agencies, I expect they would say, sure, yeah, we're rounding up all of these pictures. And you say, well, what good is that? Well, just combine that with something that's been recently in the news, and that's the whole business of three-dimensional face recognition technology, where you can simply take a picture of somebody, and no matter whether the light is dim or bright, whether they're turned this way or that way, you've got the points that recognize the outline of that face, and you've got that all in a data bank, and you apply the face recognition technology to it. There is no anonymity anywhere for any of us. Anytime we walk down a city street, we're part of that technology, and somebody who wants to find us can find us. Maybe it's a terrorist. Maybe it's our long-lost brother. Maybe it's our parents wondering where we are and trying to help us. Maybe it's a stalker. All of these questions are out there, and the point is, we're not even thinking about those questions. And because we're not, that I think is where the fear develops. And that, I think you're absolutely right with the embryonic technologies as well. Michael, thank you. This has been a wonderful opportunity.
Rush, thank you. We really appreciate it. I've many times read Rush's ideas in his column in the Institute's newsletter. So if you ever want to get a dose of Rush Kidder, you can get that online newsletter and read his commentary that appears, I think, in every one of the online newsletters. Yes.
It's called Ethics Newsline, and it's free. So get on our website. There it is.
Just like the free food that's right outside, which I also hope you go and partake of. Thank you for coming to our 7th Verizon Visiting Professorship Lecture. Go out and have some food, and we will see you there in just about 2 or 3 minutes, because I know Rush would like to say hello. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.